The subway screeched into the station like a steel animal gasping for breath. Commuters shifted, earbuds in, eyes trained on screens, a river of gray jackets and tired faces moving through the fluorescent tunnel. He sat in a polished suit that cost more than most apartments, tie loosened, a face like a photograph of composure. In his arms was a baby with a small nose and a mouth open wide, howling high and sharp, a cry that cut through the rumble of tracks and made strangers look up from their phones. Passengers tried the usual fixes. A woman offered a pacifier. A teenage boy made a joke to coax a smile. A man showed a picture on his phone of a puppy. Nothing softened the sound. It grew and grew until it seemed to make the air thistle and fray. People leaned away, awkwardness blooming. Someone nudged a headline-bearing newspaper to the man and whispered something about silence, about what money cannot buy. The father was not used to being looked at as a stranger. He kept his face calm. He muttered apologies, checked his watch, calculated which exit would get them to the car without hauling the baby into a crowd. His hands were tremor-light with a million rehearsed gestures. Passengers guessed he was a new dad, made sharp, private assumptions about parenting and privilege. Their pity and annoyance braided into the carriage like a barbed vine. Near the doors, holding a battered canvas bag, stood a woman who did not stand out in the way the dressed man did. Her coat was patched at the elbows and clean but lived in. Her hands were roughened by work that left the kind of callus that comes from intention and grit. She had a look people learn from long hours, an open softness in her eyes that had been tempered into something like gravity. She had been going down to Union Street to pick up a tray of hospital sandwiches for her boy who worked the night shift and needed a hot meal before dawn. The baby shrieked and a woman nearby covered her ears. The father glanced helplessly down at the child and then up at the women around him, as if bargaining for a miracle. The woman with the patched coat moved forward like someone navigating a crowded field by memory. She was not the sort of person to assume anything. She reached, without announcement, and placed the flat of her palm against the baby's chest. It is easy to think that gestures are small, that a gentle touch cannot alter a thing that sound has already decided to do, but the child paused as if the world had inserted a seam. The woman's fingers were warm. She hummed a single note low and sure, not a song from a record, not a lullaby read from a parenting column, but something shaped in her own mouth as if formed to fill silence. The cry hovered and then receded the way a storm might if wind finds a new path. People glanced away to seem unseeingly polite, but their shoulders loosened. The man looked as if he had been holding his breath for years and finally let it leave him in one tremendous hiss. He asked, voice small and bewildered, "How did you?" The woman only smiled as if the question were obvious. "Babies listen for a place to land," she said, and the baby coughed out a small hiccup and then, astonishingly, fell asleep with the steady inhale of someone who trusts the world for a little while. The carriage seemed to rearrange the world around that sleeping infant. A woman who had been sharpening her eyes toward judgment felt tears slide. A toddler curled into his mother's arms. Two men who had argued earlier about the price of coffee found themselves sharing a dropped smile. The father sat there, stunned, looking like someone who had been given back a lost object. He kept whispering thank you as if it were a spell of gratitude offered for something more sacred than a favor. They stepped off at the next stop together, a knot of strangers moving toward an elevator that did not have enough room for the stroller the man now unfolded with clumsy tenderness. The woman walked beside them, the baby wrapped in a blanket the father produced as if its cashmere had always belonged to them. She declined offers of money with a quick movement. Offering money would have felt like naming the thing that made her naked in a way she did not allow. Her eyes flicked to the father and then away. "What do you do?" the man asked finally because he had to put the woman somewhere in his catalog. Her answer was short and true. "I clean in the hospital at night. I watch my boy through the day when he sleeps. I have a kettle that sings better than a piano," she said. He laughed, a sound full of a rough tenderness, and then the man told her about the hospital wing his company had just funded and the grants his foundation had dispersed to clinics. He spoke in numbers like others speak in names. The woman listened and made the quiet, unimpressed face of someone who had learned to measure things by usefulness rather than by label. They walked under the rain-slick neon into a small doorway where the woman insisted on a coffee even though the father was already producing his card and pushing it toward the barista like a diplomat. She accepted a paper cup, no sugar, and drank it in 3-sip intervals, never letting herself seem like anything other than the person who keeps going. The baby slept curled into her like a secret. The father watched her and watched the small measure of peace she had produced and felt something in his chest that did not have a price tag. He told his story in pieces. A childhood in a city of shuttered factories, a scholarship he had fought for, the first suit he could afford, the surprise of parenthood at 40, the terror of being responsible for a life that had that particular helplessness. He admitted that he had always thought money could fix everything. The woman listened, then said simply, "Money fixes a building. It does not always fix a place to be loved." He swallowed that and felt the truth of it like a bruise he had not known was under his skin. They spoke for a long while in fragments until the father said, "Can I do something for you?" "Anything." She shook her head and opened her canvas bag, pulling out an envelope like a small secret. Inside was a folded child's drawing done with crayons, a sketch of a bridge and a stick figure with a wide, happy mouth and a sun. She handed it to the man and said, "For your baby." So he sees a bridge to someone else's life. He understood then that gifts were not always grand. He put the drawing in his coat pocket and kept it there as if it were fragile. Word of this little miracle slanted through the neighborhood. A barista wrote about it on his feed, making the story into a small comet that passed through the day. The father's PR assistant wanted names and interviews and staged photos. He refused. The woman would not be put onto a pedestal nor into a press release. She had work to do and a life that did not need lenses turned toward it. Days later, when the man brought the baby to the pediatrician, the nurse who had seen the photo taken by the barista recognized the woman's hands and mentioned a woman named Rosa who worked nights and had a boy in the hospital night kitchen. The man drove himself to the hospital and waited in a corridor that smelled like lemon cleaner and antiseptic. He watched carts slide by like slow islands and wondered about the small centrifugal force that had saved his child. He found the woman in the warehouse kitchen, sleeves rolled, a towel over her shoulder, humming to an empty pan. Her movements were deliberate and kind, as if each plate she stacked was a promise. She was surprised to see him return. "I wanted to say thank you again," he said, but his voice was clumsy with something like shame. He handed her a card and then, too quickly, a thicker envelope. She opened it and saw numbers larger than she was used to, and for a moment her face held all the human calculations of a life measured in rented rooms and late buses. She looked at his hands and at the sleeping baby he cradled and said, "I do not need your money. I need something else." He waited. "I need you to hear me when I tell you that some children cry for reasons that are easy and some cry for reasons that need looking into. Your child may need a doctor who listens, a nurse who knows how to soothe, a home where someone can take a pause and not race back to an appointment." He listened, and he heard that he had been treating symptoms rather than building a place for healing. On the way out, the woman gave him one small instruction: do not let the baby sleep too long on his chest in crowded places. She laughed softly and slid away back into her night shift as if the day a small strange miracle had been a thing typical enough to tuck into a pocket like spent coin. The man considered how his life had bent at the edge of that subway carriage and thought how easy it had been to mistake compassion for a transaction. Weeks passed and the father, who had been a man of many lists, added one invisible thing to his schedule. He visited the hospital more often, not only because the baby had bouts of colds but because he wanted to see the woman who had taught him an unmarketable grace. She remained herself, guardian of trays, friend of the lonely, keeper of a particular hum. Over time, each time she saw the baby she would tell him a new unvarnished piece of life, some small truth about patience or about the way a city eats hope and occasionally spits some back. The baby grew and outgrew crying fits and gained the sound of laughter that made whole people lighter. The man learned how to fold a blanket in a way that did not crease his fingers, and he learned to sit on the floor and make a paper boat with the kind of patience that cannot be outsourced. He watched the woman teach the baby a handful of songs that were plain and old, songs that smelled like boiled rice in damp summer and the kitchen's bright light. The songs became part of their days. One afternoon the father saw the woman's son playing in a patch of sunlight by the hospital's backstairs. He learned that the boy worked nights to keep school lights on and that he dreamed of becoming a nurse. The father found himself writing a note that made its way into a scholarship fund. He did not make a show of it. He paid quietly for books and a tuition. The woman, when she found out, nodded once and pressed a hand to her chest like someone who had been given a lighthouse for a night shift. When the child took his first steps, he wobbled like a tiny comet, full of a faith the world had not yet earned. The woman, standing in a doorway like a guardian of everyday things, watched and then smiled with a private joy. She had done something impossible only because impossible is sometimes just the name we give to ordinary people doing ordinary things well. The man had come to a place where money mattered less and presence mattered more. Years later the boy, not so little now, pulled the woman onto the stage at a community fair and announced her as the person who had taught him the first song he ever loved. The crowd cheered and in the back someone who had once scrolled past their faces on a subway platform wiped tears and whispered thank you. The woman squeezed his hand and did what she always did, hum a single low note that steadied a room. People told the story as if it were a parable about wealth and kindness, but the truth was more tender. It was about a woman who kept showing up to work that had nowhere in its title the word hero, and about a father who learned to listen. It was about how a city's cold can be warmed by a hand pressed to a small chest, and how sometimes the impossible is only a habit of attention waiting to be practiced.